Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Moments with Mike. I am, of course, Mike. Thank you so much for tuning in. So excited to get on with today's show. We have a lot to talk about. I was going through some of the requests and comments to see what we could talk about on this episode. So this episode, we are going to be dealing with trauma. Somebody wrote in and asked, how do you deal with and get over trauma so that it's not affecting your life in a negative way? Like, what are some techniques? And I'm not looking at the email right now. So basically, what are some techniques and things that you've done to be able to move past that in your life to develop healthy relationships and a better mindset for yourself? So, first of all, before we get into that, let me say thank you guys all so much again for tuning in. I know, especially in today's day and age, how difficult it is to get time to yourself. To listen to a podcast for 30 minutes or an hour can be challenging, especially with kids, jobs, activities, volunteering, a lot of stuff. So I am so grateful for everybody that has taken the time to listen to this and to support it. I would not be able to do this without you guys in any way. So it's huge. Thank you so much. Definitely appreciate it. I was just looking at the analytics of the show, and we've tripled our followers and our plays. So thanks, guys, so much for the support. And I'm always willing to listen to advice. How do you guys think it's going? If you have any tips or comments or anything that you think I can do better, I'm very willing to listen. Please feel free to call in, to send me a message, anything. I'm always willing to do those things. Well, thanks again. So, trauma, big subject, huge subject. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything that we want to talk about as far as trauma in one segment. So we are actually going to break this up into multiple segments each week. And we're going to go through some of the ways that I've found and I've seen work for people dealing with trauma. So let me start off by saying I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a therapist. I am a conversationalist. I believe that we can help each other by conversation. It doesn't always have to be a teacher-pupil type of situation. It could be a conversation over a cup of coffee. So that's what I look at myself as, a conversationalist and a motivationalist. So please consider that when you're listening to this podcast. Love to give out advice, but it's coming from those areas. I did go to school for psychology. I was very interested in the study of the human mind, why we do what we do, and the reasons for it. But before I ever stepped foot in a classroom, before I ever listened to a teacher or worked in any setting for school, I had immense knowledge and experience in these subjects because I had been through them. If you've listened to any of my previous shows, you will hear some of the things that that I've gone through in my life up to this point. So I'm speaking from a position of knowing, of experience. So let's get back into trauma. So the definition of trauma, I believe, is like a wound or hurt or shock. That's the definition of trauma. And it's important to realize that people deal with traumas in their life in different ways. We're very different in what we find traumatic. For example, my dog died. I had my dog for 6 years, and then she died. She was a rescue, so she was older when I got her already. But then she died. When she died, I was very sad, heard about it. And, buried her. I eventually got another dog, like probably not even a month later, because I was just used to having a dog. That was not a very traumatic event for me. My sister, on the other hand, she adopted a cat, and it was really sick, and that cat died, I think, in like a number of weeks, maybe not even, maybe it was a number of days. And that event was very traumatic to her, like severely traumatic to her, to where she had to like call into work. She had to like try to get her bearings back to function. And the reason I say that is when we're looking at these stories and we're talking about trauma, it's important to realize that with this, we can't compare one person's trauma to another person's trauma. You should never, ever say to somebody, oh, that's nothing. I've been through this. Or you can't tell me anything about this because I've been through way worse than you. Because you don't know what way worse is to somebody else. People are built different mentally. So it's very, very, very important to understand that no one trauma is worse than the next person's trauma. It might be more severe. It might be more difficult, but never ever get in the mindset of you've been through worse trauma, because worst is very subjective. So anyway, when we talk about trauma, we talk about big T trauma and little t trauma. And what I mean by that is, let's start with the little t. Little t trauma are events that happen that most people would find traumatic, like an earthquake or hurricane or tornado that injures and kills a lot of people. Those are events that most people would generally view as traumatic and typically fall within small t trauma. Small t trauma, and I mean T is in the letter, not in the drink, also includes like one-time events that traumatizes people. Witnessing an accident, being a victim of a crime, a major one, and a lot of people disagree on this, and we'll go into it a little more. Sexual assault, rape. Me personally, and remember, this is just a conversation. This is not anything that's been scientifically declared. I feel like sexual assault isn't a little t trauma. I feel like it could be a little t trauma and a big T trauma. And we'll get to big T traumas in a second. So really what we're saying when we say small T traumas is one-time events or events that most people find traumatic. So now let's go over to big T or capital T trauma. So when we say capital T trauma, we're talking more so about complex trauma. And the biggest difference between complex trauma and trauma, standard trauma, which that's a horrible word because there's no such thing as a standard trauma. But complex trauma are traumas that are ongoing or multi-layered. And that's very, very difficult to deal with because you never get a chance to heal or to work through one trauma before another one ensues. So what I mean by that is most complex traumas typically happen in childhood. Or a lot do happen in adolescence or as adults. But usually they're in childhood and you don't get to process the event before you're subjected to another event, which is very, very, very devastating. We understand that complex trauma can actually have major effects on your health, like major effects on your health. Anxiety, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, not sleeping well, not being able to communicate and get close or connect with other people. These are all things that far-reaching consequences of complex trauma, which is it's a very strange thing. Depression, anxiety, those are very big, far-reaching consequences of complex trauma. I read in a study somewhere where they believed, and I'm no scientist, but they laid out how complex trauma can actually cause type 2 diabetes. It leaves people feeling suicidal or using self harm to cope, body aches, pain, migraines, all type of stuff. Like trauma has far reaching consequences. And then obviously one of the bigger ones is using drugs, alcohol, overeating, undereating, binging, things of that nature that can cause additional health problems and problems with relationships. So I think that, in my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, I don't think that you ever get over trauma. I think that you learn to cope with it. And if you can learn healthy coping habits and to live with it, then you have a better life. A lot of people are looking to get over it or for the magic pill. And that's not reasonable because there is no such thing. There's no such thing at all. Hold on, because my mom just wrote me. I wonder what she's talking about. Anyway, so we're back at it. Sorry about that, guys. I get distracted very easy. Anyway, so where was I at? Yeah, so no magic pill. The first thing to realize is that this is something you're going to live with. This is a part of you. It doesn't have to define you, which we've talked about a lot, but it is a part of you, and it is something that's going to always be there. My mother, speaking of her, I'll use her as an example, and she's probably gonna hate me for. Well, she's not gonna hate me because she just would never hate me, but it would be difficult for her to probably listen to this episode with the example that we're gonna give. But anyway, she went through a traumatic event where she lost a child, and she lost a child at a young age. He was a teenager. And any parent losing a child is a devastating event. That's something that you can't even fathom if it hasn't happened to you. So to have to go through that and to process it, that's nothing she's ever going to get over. It's something that she has to learn to live with and develop coping habits and mechanisms to move forward in her life, so her life isn't altered or doesn't stop. How she did it, I don't know. I have no idea how she did it. And so let me take a step back. When I say my mom, I'm talking about the woman that showed me what a mother is supposed to be. I'm not talking about my biological mom, because I was taken from her, and things transpired that that we're not the greatest. So when I say my mom, and I'm talking in a positive sense here, I'm not talking about my biological mother. No shade to her at all, but I'm talking about the woman that, as an adult, that I met, that kind of took me under her wing and was a mother to me and showed me how to navigate a lot of things in life that I never knew before. So that's what I'm talking about. Anyway, so my mother, my I don't know. How am I going to just say it? My mom, whatever. She's not my biological mom, but I call her mom because she's always been a mother to me. Anyway, so that's what she is. She suffered the loss of one of her biological children, a child that she gave birth with, to that she carried for 9 months, got close to, and was there every single day of his life. And then he died. So, very traumatic event for her. She learning and was going through processing that. And then she suffered another traumatic event. She suffered the loss of another child. So that's a very, very complex trauma. That's something that, she's never going to heal from, and she's never going to get over. And I use that as an example because, going back to the question, I was asked, how do you get over traumatic events? Some events, for example, the ones that my mother went through, you're not going to get over. It's very unreasonable to assume that you would get over them. Do you think that 10 years from now, she could sit down and do an interview and say, yes, I suffered the death of two of my children, my only two biological children, and I'm over it? No. That applies to almost all complex traumas. So one, is very important to realize that that's not something we're going to be able to get over. We have to learn to cope and to do things to where these events, especially life-altering, changing events, don't put the brakes on our life. And that's a very, very, very hard thing to do, because you can be doing it for years or for months and then slip up, wake up one day and can't handle it. And then it feels like all your work was for nothing. Like I said, trauma is a very, very strange thing. Almost as strange as grief. But that's a topic for another day. Getting back to this. So I'm going to share some traumatic events that I went through as a child, and give you the understanding of what I mean by complex trauma or layered traumas. So, as you know, from our previous shows, I was adopted. Now, before I was adopted, before I was taken from my biological mother, the woman that gave birth to me, even though she had her demons and major, major issues with drugs, and she was very young. It's not an excuse, but she was very young herself and had these major issues. We were very, 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 very close. Extremely close. I was her first child, and obviously she was my only mother. And to a child, mom is God in the eyes of a child. So to me, this is like God. And so I started going through traumatic events before I ever left her custody. Like I said, she had an issue with drugs. So the things that she would do were they didn't make sense, but people do a lot of things that don't make sense for drugs. She started dating a guy, and I think because these events were so traumatic is why I remember them so vividly. But she started dating a guy when I was super young. I think I was 7 or 8 when I was taken away from her. So this was years and years before that. She dated this guy. He had his own son. And my mother had me, and she ended up moving in with him. And we were all living together. Now, this guy was giving my mother drugs, obviously, and keeping her addicted. So she would pretty much do whatever she had to do or what he wanted her to do. He was not very fond of me at all. He wasn't very fond of me at all. And, excuse me, he didn't mind showing it. He had a very weird habit of having his son fight me. His son was a little bit older than I was, and he'd tell him to fight me or do things to me to for entertainment. And his son did. He did it because I was his dad, and he was probably scared of him just as much as I was. But anyway, the kid would, push me around or try to fight me or, knock me down, whatever. And so I came to hate him and his son. I couldn't stand him. But I also had an issue with my temper younger. So I wasn't the type of kid to just be pushed around and bullied. I fought back, and obviously fighting back makes for a better show. So eventually I learned not to fight back. Eventually I learned that when I didn't fight back, these episodes and instances would be short and they would be over. So I did not have a great concept of time, obviously, because I was a child. So I don't know how long that went on for, but eventually it stopped. It became a very, very, very old habit for him. So that's one traumatic event, one traumatic situation, and it was consistent and ongoing, which caused a complex trauma for me. And then before I had a chance to process that or to understand it, other events happened. This man, I think he started to realize that a better way of getting to me and getting to my mother was to use our relationship. He seen that I was very close to her, and also I was her firstborn child. So, if he interfered with that, that would get a bigger reaction out of me and probably out of her than it would with me fighting his son. So anytime this guy yelled at my mom, and they yelled a lot, I get mad. I get very upset. And I'd run to her. I'd try to get in her arms or jump in front of her or yell back at him. And he thought that was funny. So, obviously he said do it a lot. He'd yell at her or push her or hit her or whatever. And it was very traumatic for me because anytime his voice would raise, I'd freak out. My heart would start racing. I just get very, very, very upset. So one day he put me in his dog's cage and locked me in there so that I couldn't get out. And he started yelling at and fighting with my mom. And they were fighting pretty bad. He started beating on her. And it freaked me out because I couldn't get to her. I was stuck in this cage, so I couldn't get to her. I couldn't help her. I couldn't do anything. I just had to sit there and watch. And eventually I would turn around and put my head in my hands and scream, whatever. And he did this for fun, for sport. But he would also do it when they really were fighting. Because controlling me was another way to control her. So that was very traumatic. And that had long-lasting and devastating effects on me as well because it made me, growing up and through my formative years and as an adolescent and even as a young adult, I developed an unhealthy habit of somebody I cared about. I was very uncomfortable letting them go or not being in their presence or always wondering if something was going to happen to them. I did not like being around somebody I cared about, and it was very, very, very unhealthy because that was a very not isolated situation, but that was a very one-off situation, and I didn't realize that. Um, so it hindered me as far as developing relationships because I I didn't I didn't even like to attempt to develop relationships because I didn't like how they made me feel. Not because I didn't care about people or I didn't, you know, love people, but the anxiety and the emotion that always came back when I got to the level of deeply caring about somebody was almost too much for me to deal with. And I believe that it went back to those things, to those situations. Um, so that's one example. And another thing that this guy used to do, and I was a mama's boy. I'm not gonna lie at all. Like I said, my biological mother, I was her first child, and she was my mother. So for a long time, I was the only child. So her attention was mine, whatever. And anywhere she went, I went. So when she went to sleep, I was in the bed right next to her until she got with this guy, and he wanted to be the only guy in the bed with her, which I totally understand. There comes a time when you don't sleep with your mother. It's just weird. But so what he would do is he would put me in a closet and shut the door whenever he wanted his time with her, or when they were watching TV or whatever. He just put me in a closet, and I'd have to stay there until he decided that I could come out. And it really just amplified my fears that something would happen to my mother. But eventually, at some point, and I don't know what the situation was, she decided that this wasn't the situation that we should be in. And one night, she came and opened that closet, and she pulled me out of it and took off. We took off. Like, we left. We were running around, running down the street in the middle of the night. And, well, I don't know. It could have been 8 o'clock at night. I was a young kid. All I know is it was really dark and really cold. And we didn't stop to get shoes, gloves, nothing. We just left. But I was happy because we were gone. We were out of the situation. And that made me very happy. So then we went to my grandmother's house. We lived there for a little while. And things were okay. Things were good. We were, my mom, she still had her issues. She'd take off for a couple of days and then she'd come back. So we were okay. I could relax a little bit. But because of what I had experienced with that prior situation, I did not like letting her leave. Anytime she left, I got super bad. I'd catch an attitude. I'd freak out to the point that most of the time she took me with her, but sometimes she couldn't. But eventually I learned that she would be back. She always came back. One day she didn't come back, and she didn't come back for a long time, and I freaked out because I did not know where she was. And that was a shock to me, which is a definition of trauma. One of the definitions of trauma is shock. And now that I kind of gave you a little history of it, you can understand why it was a shock. She didn't come back, so I freaked out. I asked my grandmother where she was. Nobody would give me any answers. I started freaking out. I didn't see her again after that for a very, very, very long time. And it mentally messed me up. It destroyed me. I couldn't focus on anything else. But you know what they say, time heals all things. So she started to become like an ache and not a oh my god, where's my mom all the time thing. I was placed in a foster care. And so with new situations and being a very young child, my attention was diverted temporarily. I will always go back to where is she and that type of thing. But eventually it didn't hurt so much. And not having the opportunity to deal with that before being exposed to yet another trauma that we'll get into on the next episode. It's been 30 minutes already, so we have to get ready to wrap this up. The next one will be an hour, but this one's only going to be about 30 minutes. But let me just wrap this up and then we'll continue next time. Not being able to deal with and process that, or to come up with healthy coping habits, also had long-term effects and far-reaching consequences in my life moving forward, because a hindrance to me developing relationships, healthy relationships, was the fear that nobody was going to stay, that they at any point would be gone. And it became my biggest nightmare. I refused to open up to anybody. I taught myself that everybody was temporary because people don't stay. And again, growing up, adolescent, young adult, that became my mantra. That became part of my psyche. So I was doomed from the start as far as developing healthy relationships. But even if we don't talk about healthy relationships, even if we talk about just personal habits and good mental health and all around well-being, I was doing from the start as far as that too, because I had this hardwired in my psyche that I was never gonna, it was always just gonna be me no matter what. So that's one of my examples of complex trauma, which again is a trauma that's ongoing or layered. You deal with one traumatic event after another without having the time to process and to deal through with the one that you previously experienced. But anyway, when we come back, I will get back into that story. I'll wrap that up and show you how it ties into the subject matter that we're talking about today, which is complexities of trauma. And we're going to go from there. Like I said, this is a very delicate subject. It's very difficult, and it's very complicated. So we're going to spend quite a few episodes on this. So bear with me. We're going to get it together. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out to listen today, and allowing me to share my story and experiences with you. These aren't easy things to talk about. I've learned though to detach myself from it. I know most of these things were not my fault and I can help them, but I also know that if I share them, they might be able to have far-reaching consequences on somebody else in a different way, to help, or somebody might be able to get something from it that I couldn't at the time. So anyway, thank you so much, guys. I'm going to go ahead and get this uploaded and published so that you guys can listen to it. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please text them to 989-992-2897. Again, that number is 989-992-2897, or send me an email, MikeyW251987@gmail.com. Again, that's MikeyW251987@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Really appreciate it. And until next time, see you soon. Moments with Mike.